Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a number of people who are joining us while we're presenting. So I think rather than wait, we will probably start sort of carrying on if that's okay. I'm Jürgen. I'm partner and head of life sciences, pharma and medtech at MHA. We're a top 13 firm of chartered accountants and a member of Baker Tilly International, which is a globally ranked 9th. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the webinar where we will discuss issues that are relevant for life science companies when growing their businesses internationally. Our focus today is very much to provide you with some additional and invaluable insights for planning for the next stage of development and commercialization. Just before we get started, I would like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the aim is that we will distribute this in the next couple of days together with our next future event as well. The plan is to basically have 40 minutes or so to discuss on hopefully topical issues that you'll find of interest, and then that will be followed by a Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function so that we can answer some of your questions later on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my fellow panelists. Arun?
Thanks, Jürgen. So my name is Arun. I look after the Baker Tilly EMEA Life Sciences practice, work out of the London office. In fact, we share an office with the MHA, Jürgen's team too. So I think the perspective that I really want to bring to this audience is that as a startup, as a scale-up, you're looking to focus some of your resources on science first, on clinical research. At the same time, you want to pay quite a bit of attention on commercialization of your products too. So how do you manage this balance? That's what some of the services that we provide at Baker Tilly offers. I'm super excited to join a fellow panelist to have this discussion. Yeah, looking forward to speaking to all of you. Cheers.
Sure. Peter?
Thanks, Jürgen. Great to be joining you and the rest of the panel today. So my name is Peter Bannister. I'm Managing Director of Romilly Life Sciences. We're a Baker Tilly partner organisation. And in an attempt to succinctly describe what I do, I would describe it as full life cycle product development in the healthcare and life sciences space. And what that means in practice is working with teams of all shapes and sizes across the sectors to plan out and advance the roadmap, both in terms of technology, but also evidence to ensure that new innovations actually get to the clinic as quickly as possible and then scale as widely as they are able to do so. And that can include technologies ranging from hardware devices for diagnostics, but also for surgery, through to technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence, where myself and my colleagues have a lot of domain experience built up over many years working within healthcare and other highly regulated industries. Thank you.
Claus?
Yes, thank you, Jürgen, and good to be here. My name is Claus Andersen. I'm partner at Freeths. I'm partner in our corporate department, where I specialize in the life science sector. What we do is we offer a sector-based advice to life science companies. That will be advice on M&A deals. It will be investment, contracts, licensing, IP, employment, and property. And know that there might be one or two of those issues that we'll discuss later on in this webinar. And I look forward to discussing.
Thank you. Rob, finally.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Rob Dando. I'm a corporate finance partner with the MHA firm, the Baker Tilly UK firm, based in our London office, and I lead our transaction services practice. We typically work on the buy side and help clients either acquire targets that they're looking at or help them, raise funding, capital, debt, whatever it may be. We've probably worked on at least 4 completed life sciences transactions in the last 12 months. So excited to kind of hear from the rest of the panel on the life sciences landscape and answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to the team. Out of sort of about 25,000 molecules that go through trials, I think 5 leads to a market authorization, and the rough spend is about 1.5 billion per molecule to actually get through the trials and to get commercialization. with such high finance costs and risks, Peter, how can AI or technology help minimize the risks inherent in clinical trials?
Thanks, Jürgen. Yeah, I think the key word is risk, and maybe we'll come back to AI specifically a bit later in today's webinar. But taking a general view on how technology can help the successful delivery of clinical trials. The whole reason you do a clinical trial is because there are still unanswered questions about arguably the drug's ability to perform safely and effectively. So where technology has a role to play is twofold. One is to try and further de-risk the unknowns before you go into a clinical trial on human subjects. And secondly, regardless of what you know about the drug, all of us at a biological level are very different. And when you go into a clinical trial, even though the people may meet the recruitment criteria, inevitably they're going to respond very differently at a very patient-specific, personalized level. So there's another opportunity to use technology to try and manage and mitigate the additional variability that comes in when you come into a human trial. So some tangible examples are, for example, in the drug development, the preclinical trial, the in vitro development process is the development of novel assays that might produce biomarkers. So those are measurements which are indicative, clinically indicative of the health outcomes that the drug is seeking to produce before you even get into a human. And then at the clinical trials level, it's both operational, but also coping with that variability. So using technology to, first of all, identify through electronic patient records, patients who are best matched for that clinical trial. So you're testing on the most appropriate patients. And secondly, one of the real risks around clinical trials is even when you do manage to recruit people, much of which contributes to those huge costs you mentioned earlier, if you lose that person through lack of engagement, the cost to re-recruit someone to replace them are even higher, 3 times higher. So the use of technology, for example, apps, chatbots, and others are gaining a lot of popularity in terms of trying to retain patients once they're in a clinical trial, once you've recruited them.
Yeah, thank you indeed. I mean, Claus, from a legal perspective, what do you think you should be considering, when you're taking your business from, say, pre-revenue clinical trials to the next level?
I think what companies need to do in that situation is basically to do a 360 on their business. So first you would look at what market would your product be best suited to sell to. Once you have identified a market, then you would look at, again, what is the structure of your company? Do you need to restructure the company? Do you need, for instance, to separate some businesses in other companies? So what do you need to do? You also need to look at investment into your business. You need to, as I'm sure everyone knows, that it is quite cost intensive to take your products to market. So you need to make sure that you've got enough money in the account to do that. And you need to make sure, what kind of investors have you got? Have you got people, so to speak, with just money, or do you want people as well with contacts? Because down the line you may need those contacts to be able to open doors in the process. You need to look at your IP. What IP have you actually got when you are about to take your company to the next level? How is it secured? Is it held by the right companies? Also, you would need to look at your contracts. Are the contracts still fit for purpose? And sort of as a sort of a similar aspect on your in relation to your employees, you need obviously to look at, whether you got the right employees. Are they incentivized to be staying on in the company, or should you perhaps introduce methods so they get a share of revenue down the line, or similar incentives? So I think it is basically to take a step back from the company, look at how it's set up. Is it ready to be to go on to take the next step? So it is very much planning and preparation that you need.
I mean, preparation is obviously a very important part, and we have a number of late stage, early stage life science companies listening to this webinar. And if you're a sort of late stage life science company aiming to say market launch in about 3 years. Arun, what are the practical things that they should be doing, in terms of like market landscape assessment, etc.?
Thanks, Jürgen. Thanks for that question. And I think it also flows back to what Claus was saying. Preparation is all, right? So I think when you're looking at the kind of companies that is there in this audience to scale up startups, you are transitioning as a life sciences product manufacturer from a early stage mindset to a late stage mindset. What is this mindset? Well, essentially, I think this mindset is all about how do we get to from a lab kind of mindset to a commercialization mindset, and getting it right is essentially a question which can put you either in a make or break trajectory, pretty much. So what does this really need is the question that you ask, and that again goes back to preparation. And essentially, one of the tools that we think really works is doing a proper market landscape assessment. And that is essentially aligning and positioning against the current state of the market for a product. What does that mean? Unpacking it pretty much, I would say that it means that you want to know what the current standard of care or treatment is within the market. You want to know what is the unmet need, if there is one, of patients who are being treated currently. You want to know, for example, what's the current prescribing habits and guidelines that prescribers are working with. So if the guidelines say something and then you are having a new product coming in, which is completely novel, obviously those guidelines need to change. So that's a question that you need to ask yourselves. You also need to know what's the level of evidence that is needed for regulatory approval. Now you have a couple of comparators in the market. They have had success in the market with their level of evidence. You want to map against those comparators in terms of evidence and see what else do I need to do in the next stage to generate that evidence so that I can be having a robust defense against the regulatory approval process. So I think those couple of key steps are key. I would also add, I think you also need to have a proper assessment of what price you can achieve, because in the end, that achievement of price is based on current benchmarks, and it is also a kind of marker for the return of investment that you will get out of a market. So once you've done all of this for a market, then you assess which market is your ideal launchpad. So in sum, what you're really talking of here is a market landscape assessment provides you kind of a launch plan or a starting of a launch plan, which allows you to say, okay, this is the market that I want to go with, because the return of investment and the evidence basis the patient population that is there that I can go for is it makes that market the first market that I should focus on. So it's that kind of thinking that you're bringing together with market landscape assessment.
I mean, Rob, having worked with a number of life science companies, over many years, what's your perspective in advising businesses on some of the views expressed by the fellow panelists?
Yeah, well, I think there's a really common theme amongst what sort of Peter, Claus, and Arun have said already. Whether you're looking at clinical trials or the market landscape or the sort of legal documentation and things you need to have in place is kind of the Boy Scout mantra of being prepared. I look at a lot of businesses through a due diligence lens. That's kind of my main sort of my main service offering as an MHA person, and nothing makes you more nervous as either an acquirer or an investor is when you look at a business and it just doesn't feel ready. And when I mean ready, ready for whatever stage that business is in its life cycle, whether it's early stage or extremely mature, whether it's looking for investment or looking, for a succession plan, whether that be a full exit or, whatever it may be, is to have everything in place that you would really expect to have that business in place at that particular moment in its life cycle, whether it be, you know, the right finance function for the size of business that it is. You know, if you're a pre-revenue business, and even pre-profit, and even when you're profitable, everybody's always cost conscious. So spending pennies on things that you may not think are necessary can actually pay for themselves several times over when you come to go through a process of whatever that may be. You know, Peter was talking about sort of the clinical trial stage of businesses, and that's a bit like doing diligence on the drug or the, you know, the device or whatever it may be that you're, you know, the product that you're developing. Is you're testing out the market and making sure that this thing can actually fly, and that's kind of what you're doing in due diligence. You're actually, you know, knocking on the door and asking the questions, and the more that you can be ready for that kind of those questions, you know, and providing information to a prospective investor is huge. Claus was talking about how you incentivize employees and management, and again, the way that is done through offering equity in the company, hoping that it's going to be lucrative in the future, as that, as you know, as an incentive, is because the company's early stage and it's cash strapped. If you get that wrong in the first place, it's very difficult to unwind that later down the track when you're trying to go through a process. So, you know, spending a little bit on, you know, employees within the business, whether that's marketing, finance, you know, getting a business plan together, getting your financial model together, etc., is worth its weight in gold, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people, the potential drug, the markets are all very important areas, right, and very crucial to the growth of any operation. And I mean, Peter, I mean, how can you account for the different requirements between markets in part of your product development strategy?
So yeah, and again, another great question. Again, I mean, I think requirements, first we need to think about what are requirements what categories do they fall into. So I think most people commonly are not, unsurprisingly, default to regulatory requirements, because ultimately you need to satisfy the regulator that your therapeutic or your device is safe and effective. But obviously other requirements exist around procurement, which Arun and others have already touched on. So you first of all need to make sure that your requirements in general are quite broad in scope, cover all of these kind of key attributes that ultimately measure the commercial performance and clinical performance of your new innovation. That said, if we do again defensively focus on the regulatory requirements, while every region and country is going to have some level of very specific requirements that the manufacturer needs to meet and demonstrate that they've met, there is a reasonably high degree of agreement between, let's say, the regulatory framework in the UK for medical devices and that of Europe, even post-Brexit. If we look at the way that emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence are being regulated and the guidance being produced, there's a high degree of agreement between the Food and Drug Administration in the US, the UK, and also Health Canada. But the one variable that really, you know, the proverbial butterfly flapping its wings is what's known as the intended use statement. So every manufacturer has to produce an unambiguous statement that describes what the technology or the drug effect it's claiming to have, in what environment, in the case of devices, it should be used in, and by whom, i.e. what skill level of operator. And it's important that you really think about and get that right, because if you do get it right and you find another use case in a completely different country where you can legitimately show that that's the same intended use, it actually becomes quite procedural, not trivial, to re-evidence your technology in that market. But if you don't have that definition right, any evidence you collect afterwards may not be valid. So it's the kind of the keystone of your whole market access strategy. And it's not, again, although practically it's about regulation, it also drives your product development, your general evidence gathering, and as others have said, your actual commercial market opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Arun, I mean, so, you know, when launching in any market, I mean, evidence needs to be fully understood for a robust launch strategy. I mean, what type of sort of robust evidence would you think one needs to have when you're looking at the different markets that you're looking to launch into?
Yeah, I would say I think one of the things that kind of characterizes life sciences pretty much, be it medtech, diagnostic, or biopharma, really is that evidence prevails across. It's the common language, pretty much. Um, so if you're looking at regulatory approval, I think Peter already mentioned that you need a threshold of evidence gathering, or robustness of evidence is absolutely the key there. But it's also about how do you describe the product's benefits to prescribers. It's also about how do you then show the cost effectiveness of products to payers, because in the end, payers are looking for the most cost effective product in many of the health systems that we are talking of in UK, but also in Europe. So, but at the same time, we need to say also this, that evidence types that are required actually differ in terms of the requirements that stakeholders have. So some stakeholders have got a different level of clinical data requirement, for example, regulators, as opposed to prescribers. Markets may be slightly different too. For example, if you're looking at Germany, you're looking at, say, looking at additional clinical benefit, which is actually quite a strong requirement if you're looking at a biopharma who is seeking to launch in Germany. On the other hand, UK and Canada, for example, are countries where you are also looking to get a cost effectiveness argument in place because it's a public insurance based approach and such. But there are some basic principles. I think, again, Peter and Rob mentioned there are some basic principles here. And I think the basic principles are that products' efficacy, safety, outcomes data, the real world evidence, performance, for example, of products are becoming very important, especially in medtech. Real world performance of products is very important. So the intention of any evidence strategy, I would say, is that you are essentially picking up that risk of what is available in terms of data, again, and not available data, and making sure that you are addressing those regulatory concerns, which is, of course, the first gate, I would say. But also, how do you ensure that it becomes relevant for the prescribers, because you're changing habits, for example, in terms of prescribing habits and such. So, but also it is about how do you get to the right price in a market, because you will have to do value justification to the payers. So, quite important. In fact, I think that the key thing is the right body of evidence that you gather in your trials.
It looks like, obviously, once you've identified your markets, you've got launch strategies. Obviously, you've got your MAs. You're now looking to sell the products. What are the things, Claus, from a legal perspective, that business you should now be thinking of?
In that situation, you would need to look at how do you actually want to sell in the market? What presence do you want in the market? Do you want to have your own subsidiary? Would you want to partner with a local firm? Would you want to sell through an agent or distributor? I think the decision boils down to how the market will perceive the strength of your business there. Also, what you need to think about when you sell to a market is if you can align yourself with people, institutions, organizations that have got a very solid network in the market. So life science companies sell products, services which are regulated, and in many situations the immediate customer will be either semi or fully regulated entity. It's a situation where it's very, very crucial who you know. Therefore, partnering with people, institution in the local market that can actually open doors for you. And that was one of the reasons why I mentioned, for instance, with investment. Do you have an investor on board that has tried this before, got contacts within authorities That's actually extremely important. And then obviously it's also important to plan ahead what kind of evidence your customer in your market wants to see for the efficiency of your product and your service. So obviously you also need to have the right contracts in place, make sure that you can enforce them, and that they are easy to understand and easy to implement in the local market. But again, as I said before, it is very much about planning and preparation. And I think it is, especially in this sector, extremely important to identify people and institutions that you can work with. In some instances, it would be beneficial to identify local sort of hospital trusts, etc., where you can actually get a proof of concept for the market that your product works. That will make it, in many cases, easier to sell to the rest of the country, and that applies to many jurisdictions, not just in the UK or US or Europe. But I think that's a safe method to use.
Sure. I mean, so, we're talking about obviously the business looking to sell their products. I mean, Rob, what's your view in having done a number of sort of M&A deals and advising clients, or I guess either to proceed or not to proceed, where you've got companies that are close to completing their clinical trials and getting to a stage, do they go to the commercialization stage, or do they actually sell to a big player? What's your view?
Again, it's a very good question, and probably one that is, there's no right or wrong answer to it. I think there's many factors that come into play, sort of how close and good, to commercialization that product is, and how good the evidence is from the clinical trials or the market research and the review of the market landscape, what market the product is going into. So it's obviously very different trying to launch something in the UK to the US to mainland Europe to Asia, and what kind of structures you have set up there, and who you're, as Claus said, who you're either partnering with or whether you've got local presence. A lot of businesses want to get into other jurisdictions, but they don't have the funds to set up another manufacturing plant there or whatever it may be. So then they outsource to contract third-party contract manufacturers, whatever it may be. You've got to look at kind of the life cycle of the business and where it's currently up to, how it's currently been funded, the amount of funding that it's looking for, what actual niche part of the life sciences sector that it is in. Is it a medical device? Is it a piece of tech? Is it a drug? Where are these things most likely to sell? For all of those things, the nirvana would be somewhere like the US, just because of the huge population. Not only from a financial aspect, because of the wealth in a country like the US, but just the number of people that you can actually access. The general public, for instance, if it's an oncology drug or something, that the factor of these things, that the more people they are, the more likelihood that there is that those diseases or cases that need a drug or therapeutic device or whatever it may be, you've got all these things kind of play into it. So there's no real right answer. It's like I said earlier, you've just got to have a business plan together and a direction and a management team in place, as well as obviously the science and the research behind it that sort of stacks up to make your product a viable proposition that somebody's going to want to go and buy. And that plays into, have you got the right product in the first place? Are you selling a pair of Nikes, or are you selling a pair of, I don't know, Sainsbury's own brand trainers? Have you got every size available? Have you got the pricing right? It's kind of all of it's fundamental really to a successful business, either a life sciences one or an automotive manufacturer, whatever it may be.
Sure. just remind people that obviously wonderful views and expressions being shared here. So please do feel free to use the Q&A function box to for any questions you may have. Interesting, you're talking about people and the US being a large market and etc. But interesting from a clinical trials point of view, Peter. Trying to recruit patients is a real big issue. How can AI play a part in this?
Yeah, no, thanks for coming back to that topic, Arun, because you say it's a really big one. I mean, I think the where data and AI is being used across the drug development life cycle, across the R&D spectrum, in particular, is people will have probably seen news around things like AlphaFold. So that was Google DeepMind's use of AI to predict protein folding, which is a really important bit of information when you're developing drugs initially in silico. When it comes to recruitment, then what we're able to then do is use machine learning techniques such as AI, which fall under the category of AI, to intelligently look for patients within stored medical data. And as we all know, medical data, unfortunately, is still very fragmented these days. So it's not trivial to search through a single record for an individual. But what techniques such as AI are able to do increasingly is to search across quite mixed sources of data and identify patients who are much more likely to be positive responders and better fits for the clinical trial. What we're also seeing is, building on comments made earlier, is no matter the indications for the drug, there are going to be individual level responses due to people's individual genomic makeup, what's obviously often known as pharmacogenomics, so the interaction between an individual's DNA and a particular drug. And there are real-world examples. If you give the same drug to two twins, you can expect very different results. And of course, clinicians want to be able to manage and predict and mitigate that variation in efficacy of treatments. So increasingly for clinical trial recruitment, where there is anticipated to be a subpopulation effect like that pharmacogenomic variability, that kind of DNA, which as we hear is being routinely collected, there are practical examples of how that information is being used to further stratify and select patient. And I think the other area is looking at the other way around. It's also, again, in terms of that de-risking model, artificial intelligence in some senses can be used to predict outputs of a system, of a person, of a process. And so there's growing interest in how you can use AI to, before a trial starts, but then once it's in progress, to predict the outcome, either so that you can actually close the trial earlier and move to market faster, or so that you can make sure as you move forward, you're still asking the right questions and you don't go in with blinkers on and end up with a set of outputs that don't really allow you to move forwards. So many more examples, but I think it's really down to managing the individual responses and then trying to predict rather than be surprised by the interim and the final outputs of the clinical trial and help you use that data in the most positive way possible.
Sure. I mean, Arun, from a regulatory approval perspective, and the comments that Peter's made, what are your observations?
I think the key really is, if you're looking at regulatory approvals, looking at marketing authorization, which is the first stage, you need, one is the trial recruitment that Peter mentioned is absolutely key. And any approach which enriches, which fastens and makes it a success is super important. Not just financially, I think it's important because you are gathering the right kind of evidence and a robust body of evidence. I think that's one perspective I would like to bring to the audience. Why? Because that robust evidence that you then collect through the trial of the right patient cohorts with the right follow-up, for example, during trials, then becomes a evidence body which actually is useful to present to, say, an FDA submission or a EMA submission or to MHRA. So that's the first aspect. I think the second thing is that it's also necessary that we also look at other types of evidence, because you're looking at not just trial data, but also real world evidence, for example, has become very important because in the end, the product needs to work in real life. So the real world evidence has become very important, especially when you're looking at cost effectiveness and such, because when you bring a product into the market, it needs to be effective, but also it needs to be cost effective, and it needs to be in the real world cost effective. So therefore, real world evidence actually is becoming important. And that, especially when you're looking at HTA submissions and such, is a significant kind of direction of travel for most regulatory authorities who are looking at reimbursement approvals. So these two are the key areas I would kind of focus our audience's attention to in terms of regulatory evidence and regulatory trial-based evidence generation, but also real-world evidence generation that we are doing. That's also becoming important.
Sure. I mean, Claus, we all have this concern of the value of death and that. I mean, how do you mitigate the effects of that?
Well, again, I think it's a question of planning. It's a question of making sure that that you've got a realistic picture of how long it takes to develop your product before it goes to the market. So that means that you need to have a think about what would happen if things don't necessarily go as smoothly as you expect. You need to have a open and transparent dialogue with your stakeholders and your investors. So if you need more money at some point, it's not a surprise. But also, if you need to recruit more people with particular specialist skills, then again you need to have an open dialogue with your investors, because obviously you are in a period where you'll be spending a lot of money and you will not necessarily make any money before. So it's planning when you need to speak to people.
Sure. That's very, very, very true indeed. Peter, maybe I can just ask one final question before maybe you go to the Q&A. How do you engage with organizations such as NICE to ensure your cost effectiveness evidence aligns with economic models and the key policy drivers?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so NICE, for those who aren't aware, is the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK. So they're the ones, as Jürgen, you've outlined, establish cost effectiveness guidelines and validate that for different types of interventions and of all kinds, therapeutic and diagnostic, etc. There are, equivalent messages when you're trying to establish, let's say, new reimbursement codes in the US or Germany or other markets like that. But I think it comes back to something that Arun in particular highlighted, is that evidence is going to be different depending on which stakeholder you're talking about. And fundamentally, the evidence that you need to collect about efficacy and safety from a clinical regulatory perspective is not the same as the evidence that you need to collect to show cost effectiveness. So how do you do that then? But I think, as everyone has highlighted throughout today's conversation, it's about planning and being prepared. But as a famous philosopher once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So I think something that we can learn from product development is that learning mindset. Go in with your plan, but listen for when it's not working. And cost effectiveness is the same. It's unlikely you're going to have any meaningful cost effectiveness data at the time when you get market approval from a regulatory perspective. But what you can do is you can go to organizations like NICE, and they will conduct a gap analysis using health economists and help you identify which budgetary but also general clinical pathways your technology is going to be measured against on a cost effectiveness basis. So you can take that gap analysis and use that to plan your future evidence gathering. I think something that shouldn't necessarily rely on organizations like NICE to tell you as the manufacturer, but you should be aware of, are understanding the whole patient pathway. So you may have developed your technology to be used at a particular point in early diagnosis, but it may actually turn out that its best application from a cost effectiveness point of view might be as an in vitro diagnostic for inpatients. So understanding the touch points that the patient experiences throughout a treatment and disease life cycle is really important. And also look out for things like budgetary and policy drivers. In the NHS, as in other healthcare systems, there's a huge push to show the net zero, the sustainability of interventions, and that plays into the cost effectiveness argument. So be aware, horizon scan for what policy mandates are coming over the hill, because that by the time you actually get to the point where you have that data, you need to try and future-proof yourself a bit in terms of that cost effectiveness argument.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. You know, it's been really insightful listening to all your views on this crucial stage in bringing your products, to the market, and to understand the different processes, challenges, and opportunities that exist. I'm sure we could spend a lot more time discussing this, but unfortunately, because time's against us, and have some questions that have come in that we, the audience would quite like to have some answers to. So Andy's raised a really interesting question, and I think it applies to lots of businesses, particularly the SME space, that assuming a standalone bioscience company has the funding in place to complete existing clinical trials to market approval, who would the potential funders outside the large pharma companies be? I mean, Peter, I know you've sort of run a number of successful life science companies. Maybe I could start with you, and please, the other panel members, please share your views as well.
I mean, certainly as the person posing the question, Andy put out, going to large pharma and an acquirer potentially is one way, but there are specialist funds, both depending on the market opportunity at the VC, but also at different scales of the private equity ladder, who have a very clearly stated and specific life sciences investment thesis. So there are a number of events and programs, accelerated programs around specific conditions where these investors come and will socialize with companies and try and understand if there's a fit. Similarly, the information, it's in their interest, and they produce this information and it's available on their websites, for example. So I would go and assume that there are going to be specialist investors that actually know your market, your therapeutic area quite well, and maybe look for those as well.
Rob, do you have any views, obviously involved in this particular space?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious suspects that Peter's mentioned, your VCs, your private equity, high net worth family offices, that kind of sphere. But also, there's obviously kind of, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, government funding available for early stage life science businesses, innovation funds and the like. We've seen investment from listed companies into early stage businesses. So they've obviously used public capital raisings to then go and invest in other businesses as well and sort of help them along the track. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, shall we say.
I mean, hopefully, I think the opening up of pension funds investing in businesses will help, right, over time. I mean, I know it's not happening immediately, so to speak, but I think the government's quite keen to actually open up that whole arena, which may actually help quite a lot of these sort of pre-revenue and the point that Andy's actually raising. So I think that's going to have, I think that's going to have quite a big impact.
I think it just gives them more of a direct route to market rather than going through a private equity fund, right? So the pension fund is invested in, is a partner in the fund. But if they have the opportunity to go direct, it cuts out the middleman and doesn't leave the choice up to them. It gives the pension fund the choice.
Yeah. I mean, Arun, with your experience on the market access and etc., is a very interesting question that's come in from Siegfried. How easy is it for small biotechs who have just won approval for a new drug to do it all themselves, competing with the sales, marketing, and distribution networks of established pharma?
It's a very interesting question. I think it's the reason it's interesting is because it's about mindsets that you end up with, especially when you're early stage or even a very successful early stage trial company with an interesting product. Essentially is still very wedded to the science because they are passionate about the product. and they have been working on it for several years, and the trials have been successful. And however, now you almost need a shift. You're thinking to how do you commercialize that product, almost by standing some feet away from the product that you're creating. So I think that is the challenge. And when you're doing that, you assess what is the market opportunity also for that product. You also look at evidence thresholds. But so in sum, the mindset is different. The commercialization process is can seemingly challenging for many startups. So expertise and experience does help at that point. How challenging is it? It's certainly doable. I don't think it's certainly doable. If you are passionate about the product as you are, I think it is worthwhile investing with a seasoned, experienced kind of set of advisors to bring a product into the market, because the value that you bring to the market essentially is all about how you can bring the product the way you see it almost to the patient, and that essentially is the key. So I think it is certainly doable with the right expertise.
I mean, is there an argument? Do you feel that you might actually link up for maybe you have a 2 or 3 year agreement with, say, a distributor, and then effectively once it's established, you away margins and all that, then effectively look at setting up your own sort of distribution network?
It's an interesting point. I think there are several models there too, wherein some listed companies, listed pharma, actually have approaches exactly the same. So they provide a risk sharing kind of approach, and a risk reward sharing kind of approach. So which allows you to make use of the supply chain, some of the manufacturing facilities and such, and get a product into a test bed market and get proven. Is it scalable? Where does I think that if that is the question, then I think it is something where I think it's a conversation to be had with a few set of advisors and say, okay, I see the product being globally launched, and these are the 3 or 4 countries that I want to launch in. Then I think it requires a different kind of machinery even in terms of commercialization. And that essentially is a new company pretty much. And that's what I was talking of as a mindset change. So essentially that mindset change you almost go through makes it almost a new company. You've moved away from the lab-based organization that you were to a commercial organization that many big pharma are. So yeah, it is certainly worth doing, but it is that journey that you get into.
Sure. Thank you, Arun. I've got an interesting question from Sarah. Should companies sell their products on their own? How can evidence support the commercialization? Claus, you've worked with a number of life science companies internationally. Any comments that you may have that you might want to share with Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, to sell your products on your own is obviously the ideal scenario for many companies. What you want to do. Sometimes there is also the argument for partnering up with other entities, or perhaps let someone else sell for you. In terms of commercialization, I think the point is that if you can prove in one market or in relation to one organization that there's got a commercial basis, then you stand a better chance. If you sell on your own, then obviously you can manage how you want the product to be promoted, but you also in that situation to some extent the subject of inspections of regulatory in inspection, and that obviously requires you to have a sales force and administration force, and it's obviously a heavier burden. But I think it should be an ambition to do. But for companies that may not necessarily be ready, I don't think that it would be either a bad thing that to sell it via a license as well. And you see many companies actually licensing their IP or their technique, their know-how in the market, and actually making really good money. And you also see companies that are actually quite established in one area. In other areas, they're basically licensing their technology because they don't need it, but they have, so to speak, developed it while they were developing their main product.
Yeah, very true. I mean, Rob, obviously, again, going back from an M&A transactions point of view, and etc., and again, having worked with life science companies where they do acquire and etc. I mean, do you have comments? I know we partly perhaps did talk in the main topic, but do you have any comments as far as that's concerned about whether you should sell on your own?
Sorry, I missed the last bit. Whether
you should sell your products on your own, or
I think it depends on where and what you're trying to distribute through. So distribution channels are hugely important. We've just worked on a oncology drug business where again there were the big incentive for our client to acquire this business was to gain access to another market, not just necessarily the drug itself. The drug is kind of post clinical trials. It's actually in being used for treatment in the public domain, and because of that, the company that we acquired has got good access to the various routes that our client wanted to get into. So it just, again, it really depends.
Depends, yeah.
And we sort of had to do the diligence on that business and understand what their, how they went to market in the US, how the revenue mix worked in that jurisdiction compared to the UK and mainland Europe. So it was a UK domicile business with a US subsid. But so again, it depends on the market.
Sure. You're so right. It depends. I mean, a lot of these things does really depend, doesn't it? And it's whether you're in there for the long game or short game to an extent, I guess, right? I mean, AI is obviously a very topical and very popular and important subject that I think people quite like. And Paul, got a question for you, Peter, from Paul. How can drug and medtech developers go about accessing the data that is needed to develop and then improve AI systems?
No, it's a great one. I mean, I think there are a number of initiatives in place at the moment, but with strengths and weaknesses, quite honestly, at the moment, that I think there is still inevitably a reliance on proprietary data sets, which doesn't necessarily move the global state of healthcare on as fast as we'd all like it to. But nonetheless, within the NHS, for example, and across Europe, there's fairly well-established use of what are known as secure data environments. So these are, if you like, cold stores where public health data is looked after by the healthcare provided by the government, essentially, and then under very, very careful supervision, other entities, whether they be collaborators from the universities or from industry itself, are allowed very carefully controlled access to this data at the appropriate level of anonymization. And that can be very useful when you're developing a, let's say, a diagnostic tool that uses artificial intelligence algorithms to try and automatically detect cancer from X-rays, because it gives you access to a much wider body of data. But again, it's controlled as to make sure that really public trust is maintained in the way that individuals' data is being used. And I think there's still work to be done on both sides to try and get the right balance between innovation without compromising safety and data integrity. And then I think to support the development of artificial intelligence tools, that there are a number of what's known in software terms as open source solutions, so ones which are actually freely available, which is only part of the solution, because in order to operate those tools, you require quite a high level of expertise. And I'm sure, as many people are aware, the people who can develop software and artificial intelligence are at a premium, more so than they've ever been before. So just being able to download the code from the internet doesn't solve the problem in itself, but nonetheless, it's a helpful tool that can help bootstrap certain projects and move them further forwards in the development, and allow them to take advantage of these techniques when otherwise they might not have been able to.
Sure. Thank you very much, Peter. I've got a follow-up question from Siegfried. I think maybe the last one that might have to take today. His question is, what type of situation during clinical trials leads commonly to the most difficult go/no-go decision? Is it more often caused by the science or funding/commercial constraints? I guess it's probably a bit of both, and maybe the word that Rob likes using depends, but maybe Arun or Claus, would one of you like to take that?
Yeah, I'll go first, and probably Claus do jump in. But my having looked at the market for a while and having been part of many of the no-go decisions of either reimbursement or even marketing authorization end, I think one thing which stands out is that you need to have at least in Europe and in some of the key markets in Europe, as well as in the US, you need to really have a strong body of evidence, which actually provides a robust, confident gaze on the endpoints that you are trying to meet for a certain condition, for a certain disease area. So I think that's my quick 2 pence. Claus?
Yeah, and I think again it ties into what we talked about a lot: planning and preparation, in both in terms of funding, but also in terms of obviously the science have been worked through, and there are some clear criteria for what you want to demonstrate with the clinical trials, which will lead to your which Peter talked about, your mission statement down the line, because also you need to demonstrate to potential investors and other stakeholders in the future that what you have tested is actually that the drug, the method is actually working in that regard. It's sometimes easier said than done when you sit from afar and look at it, but I think it is very important.
If I can just add as well, I think in the cold light of day, you could have the best product in the world, but if you run out of money, if the funding disappears, there's nowhere to go. So it does definitely. I'll use the word depends again, but it's fundamental. Like I said, you could have the best product in the world, but if your financing strategy is wrong and you run out, you burn all the cash before you actually, you've gone to market and started generating cash. And even if you grow too quickly, you can grow yourself broke. So it's really important to kind of get that forecasting, that modelling, that financing structure right.
I guess one of the problems, obviously, with particularly pre-revenue life science companies is the unknown, isn't it? It's you can't always have that spare cash. Things are always generally a bit tight, and it's a challenge that one faces. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. The recording will be made available to you shortly. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for our next event. I mean, I think AI seems very topical, so you may well be on that particular one, but please look out for our next event. For those who would like more information on the topics discussed today, you can find all the relevant contacts on our website. Additionally, I'd like to thank the speakers for sharing their expertise. It was very, very insightful, I must say. Thank you and goodbye.